about the BM, I'm actually the curator of Rome and Britain, but that doesn't include coins. Those are done by the coin fund. But I still dabble in coins, and one of my primary interests, and still in coins, is the early coinage of Pompeii, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But I'm also going to try to look towards the future and where we can really go with coin studies afterwards. And as Rick said, this is about how material culture really connects with the sort of wider world, and that's certainly an area that I'd quite like to do more research on. Incidentally, this is a really nice painting by Andy Warhol of Vesuvius erupting, which I always like to show in talks. The first thing to say is more general stuff about coins. Coins are something that we all grow up with and we all kind of take for granted. But I think most economic historians would probably agree that in the future, at some point in the future, coins are going to be a thing of the past. Increasingly, we don't use coins, we use electronic means of payment. Some of my younger colleagues at the museum never use coins at all. They make all their payments using their debit cards, credit cards, and so on, these contactless payments. They just think coins are an inconvenience, and so they actually basically just don't use coins, which is actually quite interesting. I certainly grew up without those types of things. I'm sure Barry remembers days when even before decimalisation. So I think it's important to bear this in mind. Because at some point when coinage does finally disappear, it's going to bring to an end a system that's worked very effectively for about 2,500 years. So this is basically why it's important to study coinage, because it's not going to be with us forever. And so sites like Pompeii are very, very important in terms of how coins are used. I always show this because it's an interesting example of what happens during an economic crisis. As everyone knows, Greek economy is one of a number of economies that's collapsed recently, and at Volos in Greece, they've resolved some of the problems relating to the collapse of the euro and so on by reintroducing a system of barter. It's not quite barter as what we think of as barter, which is basically exchanging goods, surpluses of goods between peoples. It's an electronic barter system where you say you're a hairdresser, or you make textiles or something, then you're kind of given credits, electronic credits, which you can then use in the marketplace in order to exchange these goods and services. So it's, as I say, it's a way of getting around the problems that people have of not basically having euros, but they do have things to offer. Now Pompeii is interesting because it's a town where it's possible to witness when you go from a system of not having coinage to one where you become heavily reliant on using coinage. Pompeii, let's say Pompeii is established in about the 6th century BC, possibly the settlement in the region earlier than that, but let's say around about 600 BC. For the next 300 years, they're not using coinage. So we can only imagine that their main systems of exchange are things like barter and so on. But certainly by the time of the eruption in AD 79, we can be sure that the town is incredibly reliant on coinage for most day-to-day transactions. So you've gone from a situation where they're not using coins at all to one in which they're very heavily reliant on coins for a lot of their commercial transactions. And what I want to do is explain or try to explore how this came about, how this reliance on coins came about, and also to look at some of the wider Mediterranean connections which the coins can tell us about. Now the main part of my talk is going to focus on the assemblage of coins which I studied, as Rick mentioned, which I've recently published. You can have a look at that publication after if you wish. Of 1,500 coins from the Insula 6-1. But before I turn my attention to the coins themselves, I just want to say something about what we know of coins in Pompeii at the time of the eruption in AD 79. Now, not surprisingly, the eruption phase
gives us a number of examples of coins and coins in use and so on. I mean, as an example, this is one of the people fleeing the eruption found at the villa at Atlantis, was found with, this is obviously forearm of a bracelet. So this is someone who's been overwhelmed by the eruption, by one of the pyroclastic flows, but was also found with two groups of coins, which clearly they gathered together in order to basically gather some of their wealth and flee with that material. And this particular individual was found with 80 or so freshly struck gold coins of Vespasian, so one of the very recent emperors. Vespasian died only a few months before the eruption occurred. And these green coins are actually silver coins. They're only green because the copper has come to the surface, and these are actually mainly Roman Republican coins, which are very high quality silver. So they've clearly chosen those coins for a reason. These are intrinsically valuable, high value coins which they've gathered together and taken with them. So that's one form of evidence. The other form of evidence is things like wall paintings. So this is a very interesting wall painting because it includes two piles of coins. It includes a mixed pile of gold and silver coins, which obviously have parallels with this group here, and a separate pile of bronze coins. This is quite useful to us because it makes that distinction between gold and silver coins which have got intrinsic value, similar to bullion, and very useful for high level, high value transactions, and bronze coins. And bronze coins will only work if they can be exchanged up into higher forms of currency, and the society has to accept that as consistent. That's the only way that they can work. You have to be able to turn those into those. It's another subtlety of what's going on at this time. Economically speaking, that's quite a sophisticated way of operating. This is also an interesting illustration. It's a quite famous set of scenes of cupids engaged in various types of activity, and there's some dispute about what's going on here. The cupids are involved in weighing out small amounts of metal. For example, here they're clearly striking stuff here on an anvil. Some people call this the jewellery makers, but others have suggested that this shows them making coins, which may or may not be the case. All this goes to show how much coinage was very much embedded in Pompeian society at the time of the eruption. And then, of course, the other form of evidence we have is inscriptions. So these are graffiti, which is found in Pompeii, again, very much likely to be put on the walls close to the time of the eruption. So, for example, I'm not going to read these out for you, you can read them out yourself, but so we've got references to prices of cups of wine. So, for example, if you're prepared to pay a bit more, you're going to drink Falernian wine, which clearly tells us is one of the best wines that you can get in the region. This is obviously the sale of sex, and then we have lists of prices of various things, in this case bread, sausages, fish, etc. So the important thing about this is that we know exactly what they're talking about when they refer to different currencies. So they're talking about the ass. This is going to be a bronze coin made during the Roman imperial period, so we know exactly what coin they're referring to, and likewise the denarius is a silver Roman coin. So we can make a connection directly between the coins themselves and what they're referring to in these pieces of graffiti. The problem we have is that for the earlier periods, so for that period when we want to understand how coins became important to Pompeii, we have very little literary evidence. One of the only references to coins which is earlier, in this case early 2nd century BC, which mentions Pompeii, mentions coins, comes from Cato, and Cato talks about the purchase of a meal, and the price that it cost you, etc., etc. So clearly, by this stage, coins were in use. Interestingly, you'll notice here that at Suessa,
They talk about the combination of a number of sesterces and a quantity of oil. It's an interesting idea of mixing together coins and products in order to purchase something else. The other problem we have, though, with this is that there's a lot of dispute about what sort of coin is being referred to here. This is probably referring to a very small silver coin, which was in use at the time, but we're not entirely certain. In addition, we now have a number of inscriptions in the Oscan script, which have recently been published by Michael Crawford in a publication called the Maganese Italicae. And these are basically Oscan inscriptions from Pompeii, and as you can see, they refer to various building inscriptions relating to the use of money in the very vague terms in order to construct a building or to repair a temple and so on and so forth. So again, this is useful because it implies that money is in use, but the actual term, the Oscan term, money, or the Oscan word for money, is all that's used. We can't actually make a connection between the coins themselves and what's being referred to here. It's rather vague, basically. Nevertheless, these types of things are useful. But if we want to sort of dig down a bit deeper, because these tend to talk about much more high-level purchase of goods and services, then the only way to do that is to actually start getting your hands dirty and looking at the material. And this is a slide which I'm sure Rick has shown, or at least versions of, a number of occasions. This is the insular block, Reggio 6 insular 1, which where I looked at the coins, which were the product of about 10 years of excavation, and which in the end resulted in just over 1,500 coins. All from this block, and later on I'll show you how these coins are distributed and so on, but basically they all came from these areas. I won't go into detail about the different functions of the house, of the block, but there's two large houses, the house of the Vestals and the house of the surgeon, and then the other regions are, broadly speaking, commercial areas, and areas which demonstrate industrial activities and so on, workshops, etc., etc. And the other important thing about the insula is its position in the town, because it clearly was very important as being very close to one of the principal entry points into Pompeii. And clearly a lot of what the block did in terms of its commercial activities is because of its wealth position at one of the key kind of entry and exit points into the town, and it seems to have exploited that quite effectively. So at least we can say that the presence of large numbers of coins here has a good kind of basis. We can understand why there are so many coins found. In terms of the actual practicalities of what I was doing, well, the first thing to say is that 1,500 coins is by far the largest quantity of coins ever found from below the AD 79 levels in any of the excavations in town. Other assemblages normally numbered between 100 and 200 coins, so you can see the huge difference in what we've got in comparison to other excavations. And one of the principal reasons for that is that every single contact was sieved, and as anyone will tell you who's done a lot of field work, the only way you will recover lots of small round bronze bits of crappy metal is by sieving. You do not get this if you just use hand troweling. It's very, very important, in fact, that you sieve. It's not just obviously coins, but other types of metalwork and other small finds will arise if you use sieving. So that's the reason to get that. The condition of the coins was incredibly bad. This is an extreme example. This is probably from one of Barry's latrines. And a lot of the coins are completely illegible because they're very, very heavily corroded. However, I had a wonderful conservator, who anyone who worked at the site will remember, Sass, who worked under very difficult conditions and mechanically cleaned a lot of the coins from the excavations. Some were beyond help. This is a coin which very quickly disintegrated into just some copper powder. But having nevertheless, it was still possible to identify about 2/3 of the entire assemblage. The rest were unfortunately illegible. That's a pretty good strike rate for excavated material. The other thing that I did, which was fairly pioneering, if I say so myself, was I decided fairly late on in my involvement in the project to start making casts. And again, basically I don't know of any other coin specialist who's actually done this in the field. I started photographing all the coins when they came out and when they'd been cleaned, but photographs are of limited use. And I realised that actually making casts of coins served two very important purposes. The first was that the coins themselves have to stay in Pompeii. Obviously we're not allowed to take this material out of Italy. However, casts, basically plaster casts, I could do what I wanted with. So I've now taken those all back to the museum, and I've brought along a few examples here, so afterwards if you're interested then you come and have a look at these casts. The other thing about casts is that they are actually much better than photographs because you actually begin to see something on them. I mean, this gives you a very good example of this. It's very, very clear that this is a button bull, and there's a description above. On the actual coin itself, this is just some green blobs, which turns into a horse's head, another horse's head here, the figure of the god Bess, who I'll come on to. So you can just see that there's a real value for actually doing this work and making the effort. So where do the coins come from? Well, they come from an extraordinarily wide range of places, and our excavations produced coins from a number of different places. This is borne out by other excavations which also produce coins from a number of sites across the Mediterranean. Now in most cases these are just one-offs. So for example we have a couple of coins from Alexandria, probably one coin from Jerusalem, one coin from Cyprus, etc. So there's some from the eastern Mediterranean, and there's a few also from the western Mediterranean, Carmo in Hispania, a couple of coins from Gaul, and as you would expect, quite a few coins from in the vicinity of Pompeii itself. I've got some at the front here from Paestum, Neapolis, modern Naples, Dyrrhachium in northern Greece, and then from the south of Italy, so some from Calabria, some from Sicily, and so on and so forth. Now you might think that this means that we can make a direct link between these specific places and Pompeii itself, in the sense of someone, perhaps a merchant, going off to one of these places, doing some trading and bringing back coins. Now that's of course possible, but because we tend to find in all excavated assemblages in a number of sites across the Mediterranean a very mixed circulation pool, it's more likely that these bronze coins, and they're pretty much all bronze, found their way into what is actually a much wider circulation pool. So we can't actually make those direct links. In the same way that if you're in Pret-a-Manger and you're given a handful of change and you don't notice that there's a coin from Gibraltar or something in your hand, it doesn't mean that you personally have been to Gibraltar, it just means that you've been given a coin. So I think it's important we can't read too much into this. We can't make too many Mediterranean connections just by looking at this map. Nevertheless, it does show how mixed the circulation for all coins was at Pompeii in the centuries leading up to the eruption. There are three places in particular, however, which are very influential in coinage of Pompeii. And they are Rome, Eleusis, which is the modern island of Ibiza in the Balearic Islands, and Massalia, which is modern Pompeii. And those three places make up the bulk of the coins found at Pompeii, which are very, very important. And I want to start to explore why that may be the case, some of the reasons behind that. This is just to give you some illustrations of some of these coins that we've got. So as I mentioned, you've got Naples, Paestum, which is just down a little bit further down the coast, Reggio Calabria, right on the tip of the boot of Italy, on the toe of Italy I should say, Sicily,
couple of points from Greece, etc. These are all mostly dating to the 3rd to 2nd centuries BC. But as I mentioned, there are 3 places in particular which we see a lot of coins found at Pompeii. The first one is Eleusis, so as I say, it's modern Ibiza. And what happens at Pompeii is that you get coins which were struck on Eleusis arriving at Pompeii in large numbers. And these coins have a figure of the Egyptian god Bes on, who I'll come on to a bit more detail later, and sometimes have a butting bull on the other side, but more commonly they have a figure of Bes on both sides. But what then happens is that the locals, and you have to be a little bit careful here because we don't know exactly where these were struck, but they may have been struck in Pompeii. In Pompeii they started to make copies of these coins. So this is an example with a figure of Bes on and a horse's head on the other side. And then later on, it's possible to look at a series of striking episodes. They turn into this very schematic stick figure. So believe it or not, that becomes that. Where Bes's belly is just a circle, he's got these sort of bizarre sort of frog's legs, and a head which is made up just of an oval with some points on the top. And that becomes an important part of the currency of Pompeii in around about the late 2nd century BC. The other place that I mentioned is Massalia. The same thing happens. So these coins were struck here at Massalia. They end up in Pompeii. You can see the start of these are coins with a legend on telling us that they're made in Massalia. You can see an alpha and 2 sigmas, another alpha. That's from the beginning of the inscription Massalia. At Pompeii, they start copying these coins. And they copy the legends, but they obviously don't understand the legends because they reverse the sigmas. So you get these garbled inscriptions. So these are locally struck coins. And the same thing happens basically. They also do the same with the coins from Rome, but in much lower numbers. So what's actually going on here? Well, we can certainly imagine, and this all becomes very theoretical, that coins were coming in from these 3 places, in particular Rome, Massalia and Eleusis, and they then made the decision, the town authorities made the decision, or somewhere else in the region, we're really not sure, that coins were really rather a useful thing, and so they decided to start making their own. And so the idea is that you strike these small bits of copper, small round discs of copper, in order to facilitate exchange. And as I mentioned earlier, they're only useful if you can then change them up into intrinsically valuable types of metal, namely silver and gold. And the way in which that works is that you have to go to a money chamber. And this is basically the same idea as like a bureau de change, where you go and you take along a number of these bronze coins and you can transform them into intrinsically valuable metals and vice versa. So what seems likely to be happening in Pompeii is that people perhaps arriving in the town are able to function in the town. If you want to go to a bar or something and you want to purchase a cup of wine or a piece of bread, you need to get your hold of some of these small bronze coins in order to do so. And that must have been facilitated through some money changes. Now, the problem is we don't have any evidence for this whatsoever. We can only assume that this is how things worked. We don't know anything about exchange rates, we don't know about whether there's any sort of metrology, any sort of denominational structure, we know absolutely nothing. We've only got the coins themselves and theories as to how they actually worked. But that must be what's basically going on. And we can only hope that the more material we discover, the more we'll begin to understand how these coins are actually used. The other thing I wanted to mention is the fact that the coins themselves, particularly these ones, one of our problems is that they didn't put an inscription on them. A lot of towns, when they begin to strike their own coins, put an inscription on so you know where they were struck, and they just don't seem to have done this here. So this is another problem. We don't actually know where they were made. As I say, some people have suggested that Pompeii was the
we can't prove that because of the lack of inscription, and because of the lack of, we haven't found any things actually in terms of the manufacture of coins. We haven't found any coin dies or clay moulds for make blanks and so on and so forth. I also like to show this because this is a slide of modern £1 coins, and they're forgeries. People don't realise that their pockets are usually full of fake £1 coins. So these are good ones and these are bad ones, and I actually did a weight study of some of these, and a £1 coin should weigh 9.5 grams. If you start weighing the fake ones down this side, you realise that they fluctuate quite wildly around that amount, and you can also see the inscriptions on the sides are clearly not right. That's how we can tell that they're fake. There were other reasons as well. But I mainly show this because I want to make it clear that these copies of coins which we find at Pompeii are not necessarily done to deceive. They probably are the official currency of the time. But it does add another level of difficulty in understanding all this stuff, because it might be the case that sometimes they were faking the coins as well. It's a very tricky area to understand. The other thing that we have, particularly from our insular blocks, very useful, is we have some pretty good dating evidence. This is quite unusual for numismatic material to actually be able to link it to stratigraphic evidence and work out when these coins are actually in use. And what's very useful about the location of Insula 6-1 is it's right by the city wall, and it was right in the firing line of Sylla's siege of Pompeii in 89 BC. And we have, from our block, we have slingshots, and we have balls fired from these siege engines. So clearly, within the archaeology, you can see layers in which there was a destruction horizon, essentially, and you can say that anything which is before that, which is deeper in the archaeology, is pre-89 BC, and anything after is post-89 BC. And for me, that's absolutely fantastic, because it means that I can actually look at my coins in relation to that destruction horizon, and for the first time, and this is very important, the first time we can definitely say some of these types of coins which I'm dealing with were struck before 89 BC, and that's incredibly important. Most numismatic work at this period is heavily reliant on the historical sources and assumptions made about why they were striking coins at different dates, at different times, relating to civil wars and so on and so forth. We can do rather more with material. The other thing that we can do is we can look at the distribution of the coins across the insular block. This slide shows in the broadest possible term where the coins were found and where they weren't found. Red areas are ones with intact floors, which we obviously weren't able to excavate. White areas had no coins at all, and the orangey sort of colour, pinkish colour, are areas which produce coins. As you can see, coins come from all over the block, but you will begin to notice some subtleties. These are the back areas of the L-shaped House of the Vestals with its peristyle at the back. No coins from these areas, and that's probably what's to be expected, as these are domestic spaces. They're not places where coins are changing hands. You can take it one step further and look at coin density. So the darker the blue, the more coins per metre squared found. And you can begin to see some quite strong patterns here. Very, very light density of coins, again in those back areas. Much more intense coin use along the Via Consolare, and in particular in these areas which are mostly roadside bars and workshops and places basically of commercial activity. Now that's perhaps not surprising, coins and commerce rather do go together, but again there are very few places where it's actually been able to demonstrate this quite clearly, that there's heavier use of coins in relation to commercial activity. And that's one thing that we've been able to do. I wanted to mention now the iconography in a little bit of detail, and then talk a little bit more about the connections across the Mediterranean. So as I explained earlier, one of the commonest type of coins found at Pompeii are coins which are produced on the island of Eleusis, which feature the figure of the Egyptian god Bes on them. And Bes is also known not just in coins but in other aspects of the material culture of Pompeii. There are statues of Bes, and famously there is a wall painting of Bes which is in the museum in Naples, which came from the sacrarium of the Temple of Isis. The Temple of Isis was one of the earliest places excavated at Pompeii. So clearly Bes was an important deity in Pompeii. Bes himself was a bit of a comic figure, pot-bellied dwarf with a lotus flower on his head, and his whole imagery was supposed to do a number of things. It was partly comic because he tended to be associated with merrymaking, drinking of wine, music, dancing, those types of activities. But also, him being slightly grotesque, he was designed as well to scare away evil spirits. So he also has associations with, for example, the protection of women in childbirth. So there's quite a lot of complexity to Bes. And I did wonder if Bes was chosen as the image for coins because of his association with wine, merrymaking. So perhaps the reason that he was a popular image to place in coins is because people recognise him as associated with wine drinking, and therefore the use of coins in things like taverns, roadside bars, etc. Maybe, this is entirely theoretical, but that's just one possibility. Because we have to find some explanation as to why they took up this idea of putting Bes on coins. The problem we have is that this stuff is being struck in the late 2nd century BC, has probably fallen out of use by the mid-1st century BC, and all the other evidence we have is much, much later, so it's actually not possible to make a direct correlation. I want to finish by looking at what some of these Mediterranean connections may have been and what they might tell us. You can think about the iconography of the coins and why they might have chosen to adopt it, but the fact remains that Pompeii has produced large quantities of coins from 3 places: Rome, Massalia and Eleusis, and we have to begin to think about why might that be the case, and that's when we can begin to explore what may be particular relations between those particular places. Maybe that's what the coins are telling us. So we can begin to look at what those connections might be, and this is certainly an area where there's potentially a huge amount of new research which can be done. Ibiza and the main settlement on Ibiza dates to about 600 BC and is a Phoenician settlement. Phoenicia is more or less modern Lebanon. So it was set up as a trading post by the Phoenicians. Massalia is dated to roughly the same time, but is rather a Phocaean settlement. So these are Greeks from the eastern Aegean who set up Massalia. But clearly both were established as important points on trading routes across the Mediterranean. So for example, Ibiza and Ibiza town was taking advantage of the natural harbour in the area, and this quickly developed over the next few centuries as an incredibly important trading point and stopping point from shipping routes all the way across from some of this and obviously other places across the Mediterranean over towards Iberia. So we have to think about Eleusis in that sense. It's one of the most important places for trading and exchange of goods and services and so on. Eleusis also had a quite complicated relationship with Rome, and this is something that again ought to be given more, could do with a lot more research. For example, we know that they sided with the Carthaginians during the Second Punic War. when after the Second Punic War, when Rome was victorious, the island surrendered, and there's some dispute about the status of the island at that time, but it's almost certain that a lot of produce had to then be paid in tribute to Rome. So it always had a strong connection with Rome. Then, of course, Pompeii itself became part of the Roman Republic after the Civil Siege. So there are some connections which we can make between the two places. In terms of the other things we know is that we also find material which directly links us between the Bay of Naples and Pompeii and Eleusis. For example, certain types of pottery which we find on Eleusis, which are originating in the Campanian region. So it is possible to tease out some of these trading and commercial links. Let's move on to this one. Massalia is a similar sort of picture. Massalia is important because it basically, being on the Rhone Delta, obviously gave access to the whole of Gaul in terms of riverine trade and so on. So it was a very important position in order for trading from southern Italy and in fact all around the Mediterranean. So you can see why it became such an important place. And excavations in Massalia, modern Marseille, have revealed a number of important bits of the old harbour, which is what's shown here. So we know that there's large-scale trading going on with both Eleusis and Massalia. For example, Massalia, we know that there are certain types of amphora which have been found at Massalia, which are coming from the Campanian region. So clearly there is trading going on between the two places. The other thing that we can do is make connections using other evidence, particularly shipwrecks. So, for example, this is the largest shipwreck ever discovered, the Madrag de Gien wreck, which sank with 6,000 to 7,000 wine amphorae and had about 400 tons of cargo. The Isla Pedrosa wreck off the coast of Spain was carrying hundreds of black slit vessels. These are Campanian types of pottery of the mid-2nd century BC, as well as lava millstones. And lava millstones are something that are produced in the Pompeii region and then are exported across the whole Mediterranean. The other intriguing thing is that very occasionally coins have been found with these shipwrecks. So, for example, the wreck I just mentioned included coins, including 6 Massalia coins, a coin from Rome and one from Neapolis. So this must be coins belonging to a merchant that went down with a ship. So again, we can start to make those connections with our material. But again, this is all stuff that needs to be more fully explored. The problem with the shipwreck evidence, though, is that we very rarely can establish where they were coming from, where they were planning to go to. It's quite hard to make direct connections between the different cargoes that we find. It's hard to actually know exactly what their plan was in terms of their movements around the Mediterranean and when the ship sunk. So there's more work to be done there. Okay, so I'm going to finish there, but I just wanted to summarise by saying I've been able to do quite a lot with the coin assemblage from Pompeii in terms of the types of coins that were in use and the development of the coins, their distribution and so on. And really I think the next step is to gain a much better understanding of how widely these coins were used in that region, but also to begin to explore some of these connections, because if the coins are telling us there seems to be a special relationship between Pompeii and Rome and Eleusis and Massalia, for example, well, how does that manifest itself in other forms of evidence, in terms of pottery, in terms of other types of small find, in terms of perhaps even epigraphy and common names across the region? That's really a huge area of potential research, and I hope that people might be inspired to think about doing such research, because we don't really know these connections very well at all, and it's certainly an area that could be much better explored in the future. Thank you very much.